Black people have asked for two things consistently for generations: dignity and justice. To be treated as equals, fairly and justly. To be treated with dignity. For our blackness not to mean that we are deserving of disrespect. Not to mean that we are less than human. That's all we've ever asked for. And over again, we've been denied. For decades, injustice wasn't an exception, it was the rule. And too often, demanding dignity meant signing your own death sentence. And today, I want to tell you one of those stories. The story of a black man who was denied dignity, denied justice, and denied the right to his own life. If you know your black history, you know the story of Rosa Parks. You know how the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott became the spark for the modern civil rights movement. But what if I told you that there were other stories? Stories that happened before Montgomery. Stories you've never been told. Today, I want to tell you one of them. Henry Williams was born in September of 1918 in Macon, Mississippi, to Watt Williams and Maggie Lowry. His family had been in Mississippi and in Alabama for generations. His maternal grandfather had been enslaved on John Lowry's plantation in Noxubee County. His paternal grandparents had been enslaved across the state line in Pickens, Alabama. Like so many black families, they endured everything meant to keep them in second-class citizenship. They survived slavery. They survived convict leasing. They survived the birth of the Klan, the rise of racial terror, and the horrors of Jim Crow. And despite all of it, they pushed forward. Henry's parents, Watt and Maggie, were farmers. They raised 5 children, 3 daughters and 2 sons. Henry was the youngest. By the time he was 9 years old, Henry moved to Birmingham, Alabama, to live with his older sister Mary and her husband, Grant Robinson. It was in Birmingham that Henry attended high school, and in 1940 he enlisted in the U.S. Army. Here he was just 2 generations out of slavery. He was a black man serving a country that still didn't recognize him as an equal citizen. After enlisting, Henry was sent to Brookley Field in Mobile, Alabama, where he worked in a warehouse. He was young and he was building a future, but Jim Crow didn't care. And on August 15, 1942, Henry's life was stolen. Before I tell you about what happened to Henry, let me tell you about Mobile during this time. This is important to understand because it sets the scene for the world that he was living in. Mobile was like many places in the South, steeped in racial injustice, steeped in the old ways where black people were expected to stay in their place, on the bottom rail of society. Segregation was the order of the day, and white people intended to keep it that way. But the war effort was causing disruptions. World War II was ongoing, and the United States was mobilizing for the fight. Brookley Field in Mobile was a key military supply depot, and thousands of people poured into the city, including thousands of black men and women. Some came for jobs, some came to serve. Many were wearing military uniforms, and while those uniforms were a symbol of pride for black servicemen, they were seen as a direct challenge to those who wanted to uphold white rule. Because to them, black servicemen were a sign of change of times, of black people moving up, of black people gaining status, of black people existing in ways that white people weren't comfortable with. And that caused tremendous problems for black people in Mobile. Because Mobile wasn't just growing, it was changing. Brookley Airfield was expanding, the shipyards were hiring, and black workers were stepping into new industries, spaces that had long been closed off to them. And white people didn't like it. They didn't like seeing black men in uniform. They didn't like seeing black workers earning good wages. They didn't like seeing black people take up space in a city they believed belonged to them. And no place showed that tension more than the buses. It was on the buses where segregation and racism and injustice sat side by side. With each new black arrival in Mobile, the hostility on the buses grew, the resentment and the anger and the hatred. And some white people weren't just mad about it, they wanted something done. One Mobile writer even wrote a letter to Alabama Governor Chauncey Sparks, complaining about how he had personally saw black people crowding buses and standing over white women and white girls, and that it was not pleasant to have black people near whites and touching whites with their bodies. He said that the Negro odor was more than any one person could stand. He wanted the governor to do something about this. But as bad as the white passengers were, it wasn't them who caused the most trouble on the buses. It was the bus drivers. In July of 1942, just weeks before Henry boarded that bus, 11 black people were arrested on Mobile buses for disturbing the peace. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were just black riders trying to exist in a system designed to crush them. This was the environment that 23-year-old Henry Williams found himself in when he boarded that Mobile bus on Saturday, October 15, 1942. An environment that hated him simply because he was black and present. There was nothing he could say, nothing he could do. His blackness alone was enough to make him a target. And on that day, August 15, 1942, Henry just wanted to enjoy his Saturday. He had errands to run and some shopping to do and some laundry. He wasn't trying to start a movement. He wasn't trying to challenge segregation. He wasn't trying to make a statement about racism. And he certainly had no intention of sacrificing his life for the cause of justice. He simply wanted to go about his business and get back to base on time. Henry completed all of his errands, and he had been out longer than he planned. And time was running out. He was in the military, which meant that he had orders to follow and a curfew to meet. So he raced to catch the bus, unaware that this ride would be his last. The last thing he would ever do. Henry boarded a bus driven by 29-year-old Grover Chandler. Like Henry, Chandler was from Mississippi, but that's where the similarities ended, because Chandler carried with him something else: a hatred, a belief, and a certainty that black men were beneath him, that their time, their dignity, and even their lives weren't worth a thing. Henry took a seat, still thinking about his curfew and about making it back to base on time. He still had a chance, but then Chandler stopped the bus, not for traffic and not for a passenger, but to have a conversation with a fellow driver, wasting time that Henry did not have. This was the moment everything changed. This was the moment when things went from bad to irreversible, because Henry Williams was about to break Jim Crow's #1 rule. He was about to step out of his place, to speak to a white man as an equal. Henry and another black man were the only passengers on the bus. Henry simply told Chandler that he was anxious to get back to base on time, and he wondered, could they get going? That was it. That was all he said. No threats, no violence, no shouting. Just a simple request, a harmless question. But Chandler didn't see it that way. He didn't see a soldier trying to follow orders. He didn't see a man trying to get back on time. He saw an insult, a challenge, a violation of the racial order. Because to Chandler, a black man was not supposed to question him. A black man was not supposed to speak to him that way. And he would have none of it. Chandler reached for his weapon, and he struck Henry with it, over and over again, until Henry had no choice but to try and escape. But Chandler wasn't finished, because in Jim Crow's world, a lesson had to be taught, and Henry was about to pay the ultimate price. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why did the bus driver have a weapon? He wasn't a police officer. He was just supposed to drive the bus. But in the Jim Crow South, bus drivers weren't just drivers. They were enforcers. Many southern cities empowered them with police-like authority, allowing them to carry weapons and even make arrests. Their job wasn't just to transport passengers. It was to enforce segregation, to remind black people of their place every single day. Black riders were expected to obey without question, to sit in the assigned seats, to pay their fare at the front and then walk outside to re-enter from the back, to never talk back, to never challenge, to never show any sign of defiance. And if they did, that's when the bus driver's second job kicked in. Drivers routinely harassed black passengers, insulted them, humiliated them, and in many cases, physically attacked them. They had the power to throw people off the bus, to call the police, or if they decided that the offense was great enough, to take matters into their own hands. Henry Williams didn't threaten anyone. He didn't fight. He simply asked the driver to do his job. But in the Jim Crow South, even a simple request from a black man to a white man could be seen as an act of defiance. So when Henry asked Chandler to keep the bus moving, Chandler's reaction wasn't unusual. It was expected, because he was doing exactly what he was supposed to do: enforce Jim Crow, enforce segregation, and to remind every black person on that bus who was in charge. Chandler was going to teach Henry Williams a lesson: that he was black, that he was powerless, and that a white man could do whatever he wanted to him. After beating Henry, a struggle ensued. Henry didn't want this fight. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't trying to challenge Chandler. He just wanted to leave. He would rather risk being late to base than risk his life. So he made his choice. Henry grabbed his things and rushed towards the back door. Now, Henry was not a large man. He stood just 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed only 114 pounds. By size alone, he looked more like a teenager than a grown man. He was no physical threat to Chandler, but he was black. And in Jim Crow's America, that was all that mattered. Henry tried to escape, but as he rushed out the back door, his laundry bag opened. His things spilled to the floor, and as he bent down to pick them up, Chandler fired 3 times. One of those times struck Henry in the back of his head. He died instantly, right there on the bus. Put yourself on that bus, in that moment. I'm sure many of you watching right now have been on a bus and witnessed a confrontation. I know I have. Maybe voices were raised, maybe tempers flared, but this isn't that. This is different. This is something more evil. This wasn't just people having a disagreement. This wasn't a fight between 2 equals, because Henry did nothing wrong. There was nothing he said, nothing he did that justified what happened to him. His only crime, being black. Opening his mouth. That was it. Being black was the crime. And in Jim Crow's America, that meant you were always guilty. That meant your life was disposable. That meant that a white man could do anything to you, even take your life, and nothing would happen to him. Nothing at all. After Henry lost his life on that bus, black people were outraged. Another black life stolen. Another act of brutality. Another reminder that in the Jim Crow South, a black person's life could be taken at any moment for no reason at all. The Mobile chapter of the NAACP refused to let it go unanswered. Led by John LaFleur, they knew this tragedy could not be ignored. They couldn't bring Henry back, but they could fight back. LaFleur saw an opportunity, a way to turn this injustice into action. He decided to do a bus boycott. He launched the Walk to Work, Walk to Church, and Walk to Shop campaign. Black people would stay off the buses and walk everywhere. The start date was August 23rd, just 8 days after Henry's death. Hundreds of handbills were distributed all across communities in Mobile, urging black people to join. And black people answered the call. More than 100 people were so moved by what happened that they joined the Mobile NAACP and pledged to support the boycott. Black drivers who had cars stepped up, offering to transport boycotters to and from work. This wasn't just anger, it was action. It was power. It was black people saying enough. But LaFleur wasn't just walking just to walk. There was a list of demands that were given to officials to end the boycott. Black people demanded that bus drivers be disarmed. Partial enforcement of segregation laws that would stop the requirement that black people be made to vacate seats near the front if there were no seats available behind them. Hiring of black bus drivers for bus routes servicing majority black people. Requiring all bus drivers to be courteous, regardless of race. Discontinuance of abuse and insults on black riders. Requiring bus drivers to display their names where people could see them. And the firing of Grover Chandler. Now, when John LaFleur and the Mobile NAACP called for a boycott after Henry Williams' death, they weren't coming up with something new. Not at all. They were using a tried and true resistance model that black people have been employing for decades. I know that the main civil rights story that is taught is that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in 1955 on a Montgomery, Alabama bus, and it sparked a movement and led to the rise of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And that is true for the most part. But that story, as powerful as it is, leaves out a deeper history. It leaves out the fact that black people have been fighting against Jim Crow's grip on public transportation long before 1955. This fight did not start in 1955 with Rosa Parks, and it didn't even start with Henry Williams in 1942. Black people have been boycotting buses and streetcars and public transportation systems for decades, using economic power to strike back at a system that saw them as less than. I'm going to tell you the rest of Henry's story, but first, let's step back and let me tell you about the history that you weren't taught. Because if you think Montgomery was the first boycott, you really need to hear this. Now, the earliest resistance to segregation in transportation that we know of happened all the way back in 1854. A black woman named Elizabeth Jennings stepped into a streetcar in New York City. The conductor told her to leave because she was black. She refused. They dragged her off that streetcar. But instead of letting that be the end of the story, she took them to court, and she won. That victory forced streetcar companies in New York to slowly begin desegregating. It was the first major legal challenge to segregation in transportation in America. And long before Rosa Parks, Montgomery had already seen a transportation boycott. In 1900, the city passed a new law that required black riders to sit in the back of streetcars. Now understand, this wasn't about seating. This was about control. About reminding black people that no matter how much money they spent, no matter how much they contributed to the city, they were still second-class citizens. And Montgomery's black residents wasted no time resisting this. They walked instead. They found other ways to get around. They used wagons to carry workers across town. For those who didn't have other transportation, they endured long walks, some miles to and from work, just to avoid giving money to a system that humiliated them. The city thought it could force black people to pay for their own humiliation, but black Montgomery residents refused. White officials didn't let this stand, though. They too fought back. They threatened black people who supported the boycott. They put pressure on employers to punish black workers who refused to ride the streetcars. And eventually, with enough force, the boycott ended. But that first spark, it had been lit. And in a few decades, Montgomery will once again be at the center of a movement over transportation. In Mobile, Alabama, where Henry Williams lost his life, the city had already seen a battle over segregation in public transportation just decades earlier. It happened in 1902, when the city passed a law forcing black passengers to sit in designated areas on streetcars. Black people fought back. Led by Albert Owens and Anderson McEwen, black residents organized a mass boycott of Mobile streetcars. For 2 months, they refused to ride. The boycott drained streetcar company profits. With ridership collapsing, the company was forced to make a decision. And in an unprecedented move, they agreed to let black passengers sit wherever they wanted. It was a major victory, one that struck at the very foundation of Jim Crow. But that brief moment of progress, it would not last. White lawmakers immediately stepped in. The state legislature passed a law that mandated segregation on streetcars, and they made sure that no one would ever challenge segregation again. The boycotts in Montgomery and Mobile rattled whites so much that Alabama lawmakers decided to do something about it. In 1903, the state passed a law that made it illegal for black people to boycott and to picket. This law allowed the police to arrest black people for vagrancy if they were seen waiting for alternative rides. That law stayed on the books and it was used more than 50 years later. In 1956, a grand jury indicted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and 88 other leaders of the Montgomery bus boycott under the exact same law that Alabama had written to crush the boycotts of 1900 and 1902. And there were more boycotts. Black women led a transportation boycott in 1904 in Richmond, Virginia. In 1906, black people boycotted streetcars in Savannah, Georgia. Whites responded by arresting organizers. So by the time Henry Williams lost his life on their Mobile bus in 1942, black people had already fought this battle again and again. And yet they still had to fight it once more. Because Jim Crow didn't give up power easily, but neither did black people. That was always the pattern. Black people fought, won small victories, and white officials found a way to take them back. But in Mobile, after Henry Williams lost his life, something different happened. This time, the bus company gave in before the fight even began. Before the boycott could even start, the bus company agreed to all the demands except for 2. They refused to hire black drivers and they also refused to fire Grover Chandler. But the most important thing that came out of this was that the bus drivers would be disarmed. No longer will bus drivers be allowed to act as law enforcement. No longer would they be given a license to take black life in the name of enforcing Jim Crow. With that victory secured, LaFleur and the Citizens Committee called off the boycott. As for Chandler, LaFleur wasn't finished. He pressed for his arrest and prosecution. He also called on the Army to investigate him. And on August 17th, the commanding officer at Brickley Field appointed a board of inquiry to investigate what happened. Initially, after Henry lost his life on that bus, officials in Alabama did what they always did. They blamed the black person. The chief of police, Dudley E. McFadden, he claimed that Henry had been the aggressor, that he had been baiting Chandler, that this was nothing more than a heated argument that simply got out of control. Chandler said that Henry cursed at him and used abusive language when making the request to get his suitcase off the bus. But somehow, asking for his belongings and asking a white man to do his job was enough to justify taking his life. No mention that Henry was unarmed. No mention that Chandler had attacked Henry first. No mention of who actually had the power in that moment. All the blame was placed on Henry Williams. It was his fault that he lost his life on that bus. Chandler was arrested, but nothing came of it. The court proceedings were a complete sham. The bus company paid for Chandler's defense. They hired attorney Sam Johnson to represent him. The prosecutor, Bart B. Chamberlain, he asked for a 10-day postponement before Chandler's first court appearance. But his defense lawyer pushed back and said that Chandler was ready to defend himself immediately. So they moved forward. Chandler was charged with taking Henry's life and released on a $3,500 bond, while his case was waiting to be sent to a grand jury. And after that, nothing. There is no record of his case ever being presented before the grand jury. No record of an indictment. No record of a prosecution. And despite the fact that the Army was promising to investigate, nothing came of that either. In fact, what Chandler did wasn't a hindrance to him at all. He went right back home to Mississippi. And do you know what he did next? He joined the military. The fact that he took the life of a fellow serviceman for no reason at all was not a reason to bar him from service. Taking an innocent black life was not a roadblock to Chandler's success. Because, as I've said many times before, injustice against black people was not just tolerated, it was the order of the day. It was like breathing air. And for Chandler, no one cared what he did to Henry Williams. In fact, when you think about it, it really was just another day. It was just another day that a black person suffered. Just another day where a black person lost their life unjustly. Just another day where a black person was wiped from the earth like they never existed. There was no outrage, no justice, no consequences. Just another day that a black person died publicly and their family mourned in silence. Just another day where white men went home to their families while black families buried their sons. Just another day where a black name was forgotten about, while the one responsible lived on free, unbothered, and untouched. That was black life. Injustice. Every day. And all day. Henry Williams wasn't the only black soldier who faced violence but simply demanded dignity. Because across the South, during and after World War II, black soldiers, men who had just risked their lives to defend America, were being attacked for simply riding a bus. The same buses they had fought overseas to protect. The same country that sent them to war had no problem letting them be harmed at home. And Henry's story, it was a part of a much larger pattern. Let me tell you about some of the others. In 1944, in Durham, North Carolina, there was a black soldier named Booker Spicely. Booker boarded a city bus and took a seat near the rear. A few stops later, more white passengers got on. The driver told Booker to move further back. He didn't argue. He complied. But he expressed his frustration in the process. When he got off the bus, before walking away, Booker said something about how unfair the entire thing was. That was enough to seal his fate. The driver got off the bus, pulled out his weapon, and fired, taking Booker's life. The driver was charged and went to trial, but an all-white jury let him walk free. No punishment, no accountability at all. Just another black soldier erased. Then there was Timothy Hood, a Marine veteran in 1946 in Birmingham, Alabama. He was on a bus when he reached up and moved the wooden sign that separated the black and white riders. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten anyone. He just moved the sign. The driver pulled out a weapon and fired 3 times. Timothy fell to the ground. He was wounded. And when the police arrived, they put him in the back of the police car. Instead of helping him, they fired at Timothy in the back of the car and took his life. And then there was Hilliard Brooks, a Navy veteran, in 1950 in Montgomery, Alabama. Hilliard boarded a city bus and refused to re-enter in the rear of the bus after paying his fare at the front. The police were called. The officer came and pushed Hilliard to the ground, and then, as Hilliard was getting up, the officer pulled out his weapon and fired at Hilliard, taking his life. Once again, like he was nothing. And the worst part was that the government knew, but it did nothing. Just like in Henry's case, the War Department knew what was happening. And the Department of Justice also knew what was happening. And what did they do? Absolutely nothing. Not a single one of these bus drivers or police officers was ever convicted. Black men went to war to fight for freedom. But when they came home, they found out that their uniforms didn't protect them. Their service didn't protect them. Their loyalty to this country didn't protect them. And what happened when they were attacked? Nothing. No justice. No accountability. No consequences. A black soldier could risk his life overseas fighting for this country. Or he could lose his life right here at home, on a bus or on a sidewalk, just for existing. And the country he fought for wouldn't care either way. Grover Chandler went on to live a full life in Mississippi. He had a family. He had children and grandchildren. He was an active member of his church and a respected Mason. He lived in peace. And in 1981, at the age of 68, he died with dignity, surrounded by people who loved him. But Henry Williams never got that chance because Grover Chandler stole it from him. Henry never got to have a family, never got to grow old, never got to see what his life could have become. His story was cut short at 23 years old, all because a white man decided his life wasn't worth anything. This is how justice worked in the Jim Crow South. A black man's life could be taken for the smallest thing, a simple request, a question, a look. Even his mere presence was enough to be seen as a threat. And the people who took those lives, they lived without consequence, They lived with respect, with dignity. Because in America, white violence against black people wasn't just tolerated, it was protected. Henry Williams was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. He was cared for and loved and respected. He didn't just have a present in 1942. He had a future. Even though things weren't perfect for black people during these times, Henry still had dreams, still had hopes and desires. He wanted to get married, have children, to see the next generation of his family make it one step away from slavery and another step towards equality and freedom. But Jim Crow said no. No to his dreams. No to his future. No to any and everything he wanted out of life. No to Henry. And because he was black, Henry could have none of it. And as painful as this is, remember that Henry was just one of thousands. Thousands of black men and women whose dreams and lives were stolen because Jim Crow said no. And that's why I tell these stories. That's why I give this history. Because even though Jim Crow said no, we can say yes. Yes, Henry Williams, you matter. Yes, Henry, we remember you and what they did to you. We say yes for Henry Williams. And not just for Henry. We say yes for every black man and black woman Jim Crow tried to erase. We say yes for every name that never made it into the history books. We say yes for every stolen dream, every silenced voice, every future that was taken before its time. We are going to say yes. Because black history is not just about what was lost. It's about what we remember. It's about what we honor. It's about what we refuse to let die. Now that you know about Henry Williams' story, don't let it be forgotten. Share this story. Talk about it. Because while the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 was a turning point in the civil rights movement, it was not the first fight against segregation and transportation. Black people have been resisting for generations. Black people have always fought for dignity and for justice and for the right to move freely in a country that tried to hold them back at every turn. Now, I want to hear from you. Had you ever heard of Henry Williams before today, and how did it make you feel learning about him? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.